All right, today's equation lesson is going to cover absolute value. Now, absolute value is very similar to what we've done up to this point, but it has some variations that are a little bit different. So when you have an absolute value, I wrote some examples up here I'm going to go through. Consider the absolute value term like a variable, right? So if I had 3a is equal to 6, okay, we would know we would divide both sides by 3 to get 2. But now what happens if that a becomes x plus 1? Okay, so what ends up happening in this case is if we treat this like a variable, we'll divide both sides by 3 and then use our absolute value rules. So keep this in mind as we go through these examples, that the absolute value portion of the equation is the very last thing that we do. Okay, so when we start with this example, this would almost be like a one-step equation when we compare what's going on. And we know that absolute value is going to be a positive number and also a negative number. So what we do is there's going to be two equations that we have to solve. The equation without the absolute value symbols is equal to the positive number, and the absolute value equation is going to equal to the negative number. Now, one thing to keep in mind is in a situation like this number needs to be positive. If not, then we can't actually solve it because the absolute value is always going to be a positive number. Okay, so whatever this is, it needs to be positive, but when we solve the equations, we need a positive answer and also a negative answer. All right, so now this would be a one-step equation where we subtract and we get x equaling to 4, and over here we subtract and we get x equaling negative 12. So our two answers are going to be positive 4 and negative 12. And when we plug this in, we find out why this is true. So if we plug 4 in, 4 plus 4 is 8. Is the absolute value of 8 8? It is. Right, over here, if we take negative 12 plus 4, that gives us a negative 8. The absolute value of negative 8 is a positive 8. So these two answers would check out. All right, now let's look up here. Okay. Now this would be an example if we had a minus 10 is equal to negative 4. So what would be the first thing we do then? Well, we would move the 10 over, and that's what we're going to do first. So in this case, we have 10. So the absolute value term stays here, and we have 6 on the right side. Now this example is very much like the one we just did. So now we write two equations. Okay, one equaling to a positive 6 and one equaling to a negative 6. And now we do our two-step equations and solve. Okay, and I get x equaling to negative 1. And then x equaling to what looks to be negative 5. So let's plug our answers in and double check. So negative 1. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. Plus 9 is a negative 6. The absolute value of negative 6 would be 6. So that would make sense. All right. So when you're done with your answers, make sure that you plug them in. All right, let's take a look at this next example. This example would be something like this. Okay. So if x were the absolute value term, what do we do to get x by itself? We would divide both sides by 4. So that's what we're going to do first. So when we do that, okay, we end up with this. Now we can set our absolute value to a positive and negative side. So 2x plus 7 equals positive 4. Okay, and now we use our two-step equations to solve. All right, and we get x equaling to negative 3/2. X equaling to negative 11 over 2. Okay, let's look at one final example, which is a combination of the two that we just did, the last two problems. So this equation would look something like this without an absolute value. Okay, so what will we do first then? Well, first we would do the numbers. We would move the number term, so let's do that. Okay, now we're going to divide by what's out in front, because that would be like negative 2x is equal to negative 8. So we're gonna divide everything, and then we get the absolute value of this, okay? And we have a positive number, which is awesome. So now we're gonna set our equations two ways. Okay, so now these become simple two-step equations. So we get x equaling to 1 here. And then x equaling to 3/5, negative 3/5 here. Okay. So if you understand the basics of equations, we can do absolute value equations because they are very similar. All right, again, keep in mind when we have just the absolute value, it needs to equal positive. In the goal, this very simple concept is to do everything else except the absolute value term first, and then at the very end, take that absolute value portion and set it equal to a positive number and a negative number.